Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. Time for your Gardening Week Live. Let's talk gardening for the next 90 minutes. Get your questions answered and focus on the topic of today, which is going to be food preservation, specifically your own garden harvest. Last week, we talked about the importance of planning for your harvest well before you get to that point. Tied in with the harvest is what you're going to do with it. And while it's wonderful to eat everything fresh, chances are you're going to be growing more than you can eat fresh. So what do you do with it? Well, this is where the preservation comes into play. So we'll be talking about freezing and dehydrating and jellies and jams and pickles and fermenting and canning and try to get your questions answered. I've done all of it. A couple decades ago, when I became a master gardener, the next year I became a master food preserver. And in addition, I was actually pretty busy that year. I would teach master gardening classes, and then often the same week I would teach classes on food preservation. And so it's one of those things that I think are very closely tied together. I'm not saying you have to become a master gardener and you have to become a master food preserver, but the concept of learning to grow your garden, your vegetable garden, and then getting good at it just naturally leads to the next step, which is food preservation, and then becoming good at that. Now, right off the bat, and I'll probably repeat this a time or two over the course of today's live stream, you want to be safe. When we're preserving our food, you don't want to get sick, make the people around you sick, or even worse, go to the hospital and potentially die. That's how serious learning about food preservation is, and doing it cleanly and safely. So when I was starting my master food preserver training and I was certified as a master food preserver, a couple years later, the extension service that oversees that program started recognizing the importance of food safety and health. And so they actually changed the name of the program, and they changed all of us from master food preservers to master food safety advisors. And so I still think of myself as a food preserver, but I'm a food safety advisor as far as the official designation is now. That's an important factor. When we talk about some of these methods of preserving, you want to follow an approved method. And when I say approved, I mean approved by an agency or an organization or a company who are following the guidelines to make sure that you are producing a safe product at the end. Now, I can't tell you how many times, because I've got a number of videos. I know most of you know me from all of the gardening videos, but I have videos here on the Garden Scott channel on fermenting and pickling and drying and making jellies. And so you can, by all means, check some of those out. But all of those are using approved methods by the USDA and Extension, and then through that into the Master Food Safety programs that I've been part of. I follow and use a lot of those recipes and guidelines from the USDA. I also really like this book, the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving, 400 pages. And I can't tell you how many dozens of these recipes I've used over the years. I put a link in the description below to this book because I know a number of you already have it, but it really is a good resource of approved recipes. Now, why is this important? So it is so easy for a harmful bacteria or pathogen to get into your food. That's why everything you buy at the supermarket has been pasteurized and sealed, and it's for your safety. When I was in the food safety advisor program, I wanted to make pepper jellies. And so John Jude also commented earlier that he wants to make pepper jellies. I've been making jams and jellies for years. Most of the people in the program have been making jams and jellies over the years, but there really weren't a lot of pepper jelly recipes out there. So we got together, a small group, and we created our own hot chili pepper jellies and jams. One of my favorite is a roasted chili pepper jam. We made jalapeno jelly. We made cayenne pepper jelly. Lots of different jellies. But before we released those recipes to the public, we sent them to the university lab, and the laboratory did a number of different analyses on the recipes that we had created, and they made the recipes and tested them. They tested the products that we made, and only then did we release those recipes to the public through the extension service. It wasn't, hey, Gardner Scott has this great recipe, try it. It was, Gardner Scott has an idea for a recipe. Let's create it, test it, and then tell people about it. So all of the things we're talking about today should come down to that. And I get comments all the time on my sauerkraut recipe or video, for instance, that people say, my Uncle John has made sauerkraut in a wooden barrel for years. Why do you need to follow all of these precise methods? Well, because over the centuries, there were a lot of times that some family member got sick and died, and that was just normal. People died in their youth. They never suspected that Clostridium botulinum may have infected that particular food product and caused botulism and the resulting hospital time or death. So it's so easy for the bad stuff to get into your food if you're not following the approved methods. So wanted to make sure I started right off with that because it is important to be safe when you preserve your food. Beyond that, it's fun, it's easy, and it really is a great way to use the produce, the extra produce that you have. And I actually plan some of my garden plants around preservation. I grow rhubarb. Now, rhubarb does extremely well in my region, and it's a beautiful plant. I'm not a big fan of rhubarb. I've had rhubarb desserts of all type. They're okay. But I really like strawberry rhubarb jelly that I make myself. So I grow my own strawberries. I grow my own rhubarb. I juice the strawberries and juice the rhubarb and make strawberry rhubarb jelly that is out of this world. I make straight rhubarb jelly, which my guess is very few of you have ever had. Grow rhubarb, juice it, make jelly. It'll blow your mind. It's incredible. So I grow rhubarb specifically for that purpose. And there are a number of other plants in my garden that I do the same thing. My raspberries. I love fresh raspberries off of the cane, but raspberry jam is by far my favorite. And my own raspberry jam that I make from my own raspberries is far better than anything you'll buy at a farmer's market or craft stand. So I grow food for the purpose of preservation. And that's what I'm encouraging you to start thinking about, if you haven't already, is expand your gardening world. Go ahead and keep growing the things you're already growing. Grow your tomatoes. You can can your tomatoes. You can freeze your tomatoes. You can dehydrate your tomatoes. You can juice your tomatoes. There are a number of different ways that you can preserve your tomatoes. The same thing with cucumbers. Grow your cucumbers. You can pickle your cucumbers or ferment your cucumbers. Those are my preferred methods. So the crops you're already growing, plan how you're going to preserve those particular harvests. But now also start thinking about some of the things that you might buy at the store that you could make yourself if you have a book like the Ball book on home preserving, and maybe take a class from the extension office with the food safety advisors teaching you, like I used to do. When you start learning how to do some of these things, you see how easy it is. I have made hundreds of jars of jam and jelly over the years. For probably about a 10-year, well, maybe 12-year period when I was teaching and really involved in the program, that was what I gave everybody I knew for Christmas presents, were jams and jellies. And so there were some years that I would make 200 jars and then just give them all out. I love it. I like making jam and jelly and giving it away. I probably like more eating everything that I make. And that's why it's so much fun to give it away, because I know the quality of what I'm making. So that's to lead into what we'll be talking about today. Let's go ahead and see if we've got any specific questions that I can answer as we're talking about some of the things that we're doing. Heidi says, last year was the first time I tried to make pickles. Loved it. So this year, watch out. Fantastic. And that's it. It's like a bug. Once you get infected by the preservation bug, you just want to keep doing more. And it's one of those things that as you do more, then you want to expand what it is you're doing and try to get some of the stuff. So Lisa's asking how we can get my recipes. I actually looked for that file because it's no longer in print. We did it as a fundraiser almost 20 years ago now. So I think it's on an old computer, and I'm trying to figure out which computer it is. So I started to look for it, and I don't have the file readily at hand. But if I can find it, I'll go ahead and either put it on a Google Drive or find some way to give it to you. So if I can find it in next week or the week after on the live stream, I'll let you know, because it's easy. And so let's go ahead and start talking about jams and jellies and why it's important to follow a specific recipe. So what we're trying to do when we're preserving the food is to keep it from rotting, to keep the bacteria primarily from getting into that food product, and then the bacteria eats it all. And one of the ways to do that is to kill the bacteria. That's what pasteurization is, using heat. It kills all the bacteria, seals the jar or the can, and now there's no bacteria in that food product. Another method of doing that is by preserving the food in a particular chemical solution or individual component of the recipe that keeps the bacteria out, because the bacteria can't survive in that environment. Sugar and a high sugar level is actually very effective at deterring bacteria. Acid is very effective at deterring bacteria. And so when we were testing our jams and jellies with the recipes we had, it was the sugar level and the acid level of the jams and jellies that were being analyzed at the laboratory, because there are very specific levels at which bacteria can't survive. And so jams and jellies are sweet because the sugar helps preserve it, but they're also acidic. And that's why you'll often see in a recipe that you need to add lemon juice as a way to lower the pH of that particular jam or jelly. And so our pepper jelly recipes, and you'll see this in many other pepper jelly recipes, the chili peppers are not acidic naturally. So you need to add acid to make that product low enough pH so that the bacteria can't thrive in that environment. And so as we were developing the pepper jelly recipes, we were working with different ratios and different amounts of primarily lemon juice. We would also use vinegar in some of the recipes and try to figure out what tasted best and target the specific pH to keep that product safe for humans to consume. pickles. And fermented products do the same thing. They lower the pH of that solution, of that liquid that the cucumbers are in, and that's what keeps the bacteria out. And so if you just guess and put some water and vinegar and cucumbers in a jar, there's no guarantee that that is going to be enough of an acidic environment to keep the bacteria from taking over and infecting you with botulism or something that is as bad or definitely going to ruin your day. Because a lot of these bacteria that can cause illness and potential death love being in a low oxygen environment. And so when you have a sealed jar that is sitting on your pantry somewhere, it's low oxygen. And so those bacteria are going to love that environment. Unless the pH is so low or the sugar content is so high that they just can't survive. So there's some of the basis, the background of why you want to follow a recipe and why it needs to be an approved method of preservation. It's all about keeping yourself nice and safe. So Carmen's asking, how long do I have to leave a new rhubarb plant alone before harvesting? Someone told me at least 2 years. And 2 years is a good target. Like most plants, that perennial plants like a rhubarb or asparagus, you really want them to have at least 2 years to get a good root system developed, because those plants are sending up their leaves for the photosynthesis to send out new roots and to become a stronger plant. Well, if you're stripping the leaves off of that plant before the root development, before it has become strong enough, then you're weakening the plant to the point that it might not survive. So at least 2 years is a good target, and that should enable the plant to become strong enough so that in the 3rd year, then you can start harvesting some of the leaves, some of the asparagus spears. You want to leave enough behind that the plant can survive and still be able to support itself. But the bigger the plant gets in subsequent years, the more of the stalks that you'll be able to harvest. So yeah, 2 years is a good place to start. Okay, let's see as we roll on down. And I have to catch up with everybody. So nice to see everything going back and forth. Yankee Sista, nice to see you here. I still have jars of food from last year, mostly grown, and some sale veggies. And so this is one of those things. So the official recommendation when you can the things from your garden is they'll be shelf stable for 6 months. That's what we were told to tell everybody. 6 months when you can your tomatoes or whatever it is that you're canning. A year for jams and jellies, because that acid and that sugar tends to be a little more effective as far as the room temperature, safety, and preservation. A year. And beyond that, the official word is you should go ahead and have eaten it by that time. It won't be as good. That being said, I'm still eating jams and jellies that are 3 years old. If you do it right and use the approved methods and seal the jars when you're canning or doing the jams and jellies or the pickles, you can actually expect them to last for a very long time. The flavor might degrade, the texture might degrade, but if you do everything right, this is actually a pretty effective way of keeping your food for a long period of time. So yeah, Yankee Sister, I have no doubt, jars of food from last year, and do try to eat those before the new ones that you make. And that's what I try to do. I always try to eat the oldest ones first. But just keep rotating the stuff you make and keep making more. And before you know it, you're going to have a pantry full of food that you've done yourself. Hi, Frumpus, first-year gardener. We have a truckload of cucumbers coming in. Can't wait to pickle them. Anyone have experience pickling and can suggest a good site? And so in the United States, the USDA actually has a food preservation site with a number of different recipes. Ball, the Ball, you buy the Ball jars and lids and the Ball book. The Ball Blue book has a pretty substantial amount of recipes, but I like this complete book because it's got a lot more. And on the Ball website, they've got a lot of recipes of different methods to use. And once you understand, pickles is a really good example of this. Once you understand and start learning more about preserving by reading the books, by taking some classes, by going to a government website like the USDA where they've got some instructional fact sheets, when you understand how it works, then you can modify the recipes a little bit. So pickles, for instance, as long as you have the right ratio of vinegar to water when you make your pickles, it really doesn't matter how much dill or pepper seed or mustard seed or any other type of spices and herbs that you use. You can modify those components of the recipe pretty easily and start refining to get to your specific taste. The basic recipe is what we really need to make sure is right. I've got a video on fermenting beets, and I actually show a couple different methods to get different flavors of the fermented beets. The basic process of fermenting is the same. It's just a question of what spices you add to get the different flavor. And so look for the Ball site, the USDA site, a lot of extension offices. So if you look up your state extension, just do an internet search for that and then put in food preservation. You'll probably see a lot of fact sheets and even recipes start to pop up on that as well. And so talking about fermenting, the difference between pickling and fermenting, very similar. They're both creating a very low pH acidic environment to keep the bacteria away from the food. With pickling, we do that with vinegar. And so a pickle recipe will have vinegar and water, often sugar just for flavor, and that's how we pickle whatever it is we're doing, cucumbers. A fermentation uses a completely different process. We're actually trying to encourage some bacteria during the fermentation process. So fermentation uses a brine, a salty liquid, and that salty liquid actually keeps most of the harmful bacteria away from that fermenting food. But the lactobacillus is one of those type of bacteria that actually can thrive in a salty solution. And as they thrive and start eating the starches and carbohydrates in that particular food, they release lactic acid. And it's that lactic acid that lowers the pH and preserves the food. That's why fermented food is really a preferred method by a lot of people, because it's got the probiotics. It has all of that helpful and good bacteria that's thriving in that particular solution that's heavy in lactic acid. You won't see that in a pickle. You're not going to have that same bacterial growth because the vinegar is keeping a lot of that bacteria away. So I did primarily pickling for most of my first decade in food preservation. Since then, I've evolved more and more to fermentation just because of some of the health benefits of the probiotics, but the flavor's different. The flavor of a vinegar pickle is different than the flavor of a fermented pickle. So I encourage that you make both, and then you can compare the flavor and see which one you like. I like the flavor of fermented beets much better than the flavor of pickled beets. And so that's a personal preference, but it's one of those things that you need to try for yourself to see which you prefer. And you can also go to a health food store or an organic market, and they'll often have fermented jars of different vegetables in the refrigerator section. Because there's another big difference. When we pickle, those products can be stored at room temperature without too much difficulty. You know, the old days, 100 years ago, with the pickle barrel at the general store, you could pickle and have a vinegar filled with, a barrel filled with vinegar, and it would stay at room temperature without any difficulty. With the fermentation, especially at room temperature, the bacteria are still going to be alive and active and continuing the fermentation process. So the longer you ferment your food, the more that the flavor and texture will change. And so you'll see some recipes for some fermented foods that might only be 3 or 4 days of fermentation, maybe up to 10 days of fermentation. Beyond that, there aren't a lot of foods that we preserve for a long period of time like that. Kimchi and sauerkraut will be fermented for a longer period of time, but that has to do more with the cabbage and the flavor and the texture that you're trying to get. You can make your own sauerkraut and start eating it after 3 or 4 days, and it has a good tang to it and a good flavor. But at some point, you want to stop that fermentation. And so you put it into the refrigerator with the colder temperature that will slow down the growth of the bacteria. And so when you go to a store to try to find fermented foods, a lot of times you'll find it in the refrigerated section, because that's how you continue preserving the fermented food so that it doesn't continue changing. And I think most of us like the younger fermented foods better than some of those older fermented foods. So there's a couple things. Let's see, scrolling down. Bill, thanks so much. Welcome to the channel as a new member. Nice to see you here. And so I will mention, have had some new members signing up to the Gardner Scott channel, and you can just look for the join button or go to the home page on YouTube, and there's some links there. There's also some links in the description below to become a member. One of the best perks is our Facebook group. And so I've seen a lot of new members signing up who have not asked to be part of the Facebook group. You have to be a member to be part of the Facebook group. But we've just got so much good stuff. People sharing pictures, people asking questions about insects and plants, and it's just a wonderful forum of gardeners on that Facebook group. So I hope you check that out, Bill, and we hope to see you there, because it really is a great opportunity for not just my input on a daily basis on Facebook, but everybody else that's involved, and it's such a great wonderful community of gardeners who really want to help each other out. So yeah, by all means, be a channel member. Click the join button, and then depending on which level you're at, depending on what perks you're looking for, they all include the Facebook page. So I hope you can definitely check that out. Hi Karen, happy pepper jelly on top of a brick of cream cheese crackers, and that's good enough for my lunch. You know, and that's actually what got me started making the pepper jellies, is exactly that. I'd gone to someone's house and they had a block of cream cheese with a pepper jelly that they bought and crackers, and it was just fantastic. And so I said, I got to learn how to do that. So that was exactly the catalyst for me making my pepper jellies, because that is, and yeah, like Katie says, it is absolutely amazing. And so my jalapeno jelly, and so you've got complete control over this. And so in making a jalapeno jelly, and my jalapeno jelly actually has little bits of jalapeno in it, I wait until the jalapenos are fully ripe, which means they turn red. And so my jalapeno jelly is a red jelly. And to put that on top of cream cheese, and so when I'd have Christmas parties, I would actually make a green jalapeno jelly, and I would make a red jalapeno jelly. And then on the same block of cream cheese, half of it would be green and half of it would be red with the spicy hot chili jalapeno jelly. So you can preserve the food at any point that you would be eating the food. And it can be fully ripe. You can preserve green tomatoes. Frank is on today. Frank shared with me a delicious jar of pickled green tomatoes that are fantastic, or tomato pickles, you could call them. And you don't have to wait until the tomato is fully ripe. I mentioned earlier all the ways that you could preserve tomatoes, and I left off pickling because typically we're not going to be pickling a fully ripe tomato, but you can easily pickle a green tomato, and it's a delicious, delicious pickle. So expanding your world into some of these things that you may not have ever thought about are incredible. This year, I'm planning on making turnip pickles for the same reason. I've pickled green beans for longer than I probably pickled green beans for about 30 years, long before I became a master food preserver. I've pickled beets. I've pickled the cucumbers. But it's only recently that I've discovered pickled turnips. So once you realize that you've got so much flexibility in using the same methods, but different produce, man, your world really opens up. Especially if you live in an area like mine where turnips are really easy to grow, and I grow turnips every year and then just run out of ways to use them. Well, I'm adding pickled turnips to my list of things to do. Julie's asking, how do I tell if my canned veggies are safe to eat if they were canned a year ago? So we're trying to keep out the bacteria, but mold can still get to some of these food products. That's one reason why we will use water bath canning, a hot method where we're boiling the jars and the lids in water to try to kill a lot of these other potential organisms. Bacteria, in addition to mold. Mold is a good way to tell that you probably shouldn't eat whatever the product happens to be. I fermented some peppers to make pepper or hot sauce in this last harvest season, and I had some mold set in. Now, when you're fermenting, you'll see a little bit of a white film, a hazy kind of mold that might set in. It's a scum. You can just spoon that off with no problem. But if you get a fuzzy or a black mold that starts setting in, stay away from that. So that's one way to look. And my one jar of fermented peppers has a fuzzy black mold on it. It was time to toss those peppers. It was hard to do, but you just don't want to mess with some of those moldy ingredients. You can also take a look at the color. Jams and jellies will change color over time. In most cases, they're still edible, but if the color isn't appealing to you, if you open up the jar and smell it, it should have the same aroma as when you sealed the jar. If it's a raspberry jam, it should smell like raspberry jam. If you open it up and it's got a pungent or a sour smell to it, go ahead and toss the jar as well. And one of the buzz phrases we had in the program was, when in doubt, throw it out. And so if you've had something on the shelf for a year or more and you're just not quite sure, toss it. You really don't have a lot to lose in that case. A jar, a pint, or a quart of wherever that food is, yeah, you made it. It's hard to see it go down the drain or into the compost pile or into the trash, but better safe than sorry. So when in doubt, throw it out, but look for the color, smell to see if that has changed. Look for mold. If you pull a jar off the shelf and the seal is broken, then don't even go through the effort of smelling and looking at it. Just assume that something has gotten into it. You need to make sure the jars stay sealed for the entire time that you have them sitting in your pantry for all of those months. So there's a couple ways to tell. And when you get some of these sources like the Ball books, they'll talk about all that as well and give you some really good indications of things to look for. And those government sites like the USDA site, they have fact sheets on those ways to determine if the food is still safe and guidelines for how long it should last. But if in doubt, throw it out and that'll keep you safe. So here's something that I haven't heard of before. In 4B1K1 says Nuka doko rice bran pickles are great. It's fermenting, but it's fast. Interesting. I'm not aware of that. You put your veggies into the established bed and have pickled veggies the next day. Interesting. I'm going to have to actually look up. That's completely new to me. So thank you for sharing that. There's always new stuff to learn, and I'm always looking for new methods of trying the preservation. So interesting. I'll definitely have to do that and or at least check it out. So let's see. SC is saying, which is your favorite preserved food? So my favorite preserved food is raspberry jam. Easily at the top of the list. I will design a garden around raspberries. And so this whole section right here in my garden, those are all my raspberries. And this will be the second year. And I got a few raspberries last year, but I build my garden around my raspberry patch because I love making raspberry jam so much. And raspberry pie at Thanksgiving, which is just incredible. So that's by far my favorite. I also really like the pickles. And so my green bean pickles would be probably the favorite of my wife and daughter. They absolutely love my green bean pickles. The key being that I always put a couple cayenne peppers that I grew into the jars when I make it. So it's a spicy green bean pickle. So that's also a favorite. And then in recent years, like I said, the fermented beets was really a surprise. Check that video out. It's a few years old. But at the end of it, I actually taste the fermented beets that I made, and my reaction is utter joy. And I wasn't acting. I mean, it really did taste good. So that's a wonderful demonstration of how you can make something and then eat it and then just realize how incredible it is. So pickled beets have been a new discovery. But the next thing I wanted to talk about ties in with this as well. Herbs. Fresh herbs are my favorite things to preserve. Now, I love the raspberry jam, I love the pickles, but when it comes to my preserved produce from the garden, it would be the herbs. I dry my thyme, I dry my sage, and I've got a video on this, of course. And so all of those herbs that I'm growing in the garden, I preserve. I dry them, and then I use them throughout the year in cooking. So I have some jars of different herbs on the shelf, and some of those jars I haven't opened in years because I'm using my own dill. So dill weed, you might make a fish recipe or make a tartar sauce and it needs some dill. Well, I've got dill that I dried last year from all the dill that I grew. And when I put oregano and thyme and rosemary into a pasta sauce, it's all of those herbs that I grew myself. So not only are herbs just way too expensive if you buy at the store, but they are incredibly easy to preserve. You just harvest them, wash them off, hang them so they dry out, store them in a jar or a bag, and now you've got that flavor for the rest of the year until you grow them again and harvest them again in the following year. So I would say on a daily basis, that's my favorite preserved food because I'm using the herbs that I dried almost every single day in cooking. And Then when you expand into some of the other things that you're growing, yeah, now you can have a favorite like raspberry jam or whatever other type of harvest that you might be preserving. But do it all. Canned tomatoes are wonderful. I like to make all my own spaghetti sauces and lasagna sauces, and it's so nice when you could take a jar of tomatoes that you grew yourself and that have been sitting on the shelf for 4 or 5 months, and you use those fresh tomatoes to make a sauce. And you do that by learning how to can your tomatoes. Now, this is the next arena to start moving into when we start talking about canning your produce, to can your harvest. It comes down to the acid yet again. So tomatoes are acidic. You'll see in the recipes for canning tomatoes that you add either citric acid, which is vitamin C, or you add vinegar, or you add lemon juice. Because while tomatoes are naturally acidic, not all tomatoes have the same low pH. So you need to add an acid to it. And the recipes just assume an average pH that you have to lower. And so you'll have to add an acid to it. But for the produce that you want to can, put in a jar and then seal that jar, they might not have that same natural low pH like tomatoes do. So with tomatoes, you might be able to get away with just adding a tablespoon of vinegar to a jar and then can it or seal it, and those tomatoes be safe. If you want to can something like green beans or beets or any of the other root vegetables or non-acidic fruits, the vinegar, that lemon juice, that citric acid is probably not going to be enough. Now you have to learn how to do pressure canning. And so with an acidic environment, you could put it in boiling water, and that drives the air out, forms a vacuum seal, stick it on your shelf, and it'll be safe. But with the high pH or neutral types of foods that you want to can, now you need a pressure canner that gets the heat up so high that it kills all the bacteria and, more importantly, the spores, because it's the fungal spores that can actually cause some serious health issues. And sometimes it's the spores that are the most dangerous, and they won't survive in a low acid environment. It also takes a lot of heat to kill some of those microorganisms. And that's where pressure canning comes into play. So that's, again, why it becomes important to follow an approved method. Because if you're canning tomatoes and you think you can just automatically use the same recipe for canning beets, you're opening yourself up to some potential problems with the pH and the fact that there might be some bad bugs in that product that will make you sick. So pressure canning is important. Now, I actually don't do pressure canning for me because I live at an altitude of 7,500 feet. And as I learned in the Master Food Safety Advisor program, heat is the important factor, and that pressure of the process of pressure canning. Well, if you actually read the fine print in the user's manual of most pressure canners or pressure cookers, you will see that there's an altitude limitation on many of those products. Some of them don't go above 3,000 feet in elevation. Some of them don't go above 5,000 feet in elevation. You actually have to get very specialized pressure canners that can get quite expensive to be able to do pressure canning at the altitude I live at. And I like the other preservation methods better, like pickling and fermenting, that for me, it's not worth investing in a high quality pressure canner that is calibrated to produce that pressure and heat at 7,500 foot elevation. So be aware of that. Most of you, it's not going to be an issue. But if you live in the mountains, if you live at high altitude, you might not be able to do pressure canning. You have to look at the equipment that you're using to see if it is able to be used for that particular. You can still do pressure cooking, but the canning is a little more specific. And it's all about the calibration and making sure that that particular equipment can get up to the heat and pressure needed to kill all the harmful microbes that can make you sick. So I have done all these methods, but that one particular method is something I'm not currently doing. And it's just, there's so many easy ways to preserve, and I just love the pickling and the fermenting. All the things that I would have to do the pressure canning, I like the taste better of the fermenting and the pickling. So that's really my preferred method. Garlic is another example of something that if you can garlic, you should pressure can it. But this last year, I dried, dehydrated, and then made into powder a lot of the garlic that I grew. And so I'd rather make a garlic powder or a garlic salt or a pickled garlic than to can a garlic. You can also freeze garlic. And so a pressure canned garlic will have some good garlic flavor, but if you want that really intense fresh garlic flavor, freeze your garlic. And freezing is an incredible method for retaining the taste and texture of most of what we're growing. Some of the materials, the texture will change once they've frozen, but if you're going to be putting it into a pot and cooking it, you're usually not going to notice that texture difference. You will need to learn some additional steps, and again, this is all part of the approved methods. Most of the things that we are going to freeze, you should probably blanch first. And so now you have to learn all about the enzymes that are present in most of the things that we're harvesting and eating. And so enzymes are most obvious in those foods like basil, for instance. If you cut a basil leaf, in just a few minutes, it'll start turning black. The color will actually change where you cut the leaf. And that holds true with a lot of the other things that we're harvesting. Those are the enzymes at play. And so when we talk about antioxidants, that's what we're talking about. It's the enzymes and the oxygen that are actually changing the color and the flavor of some of these things we're harvesting. And so you need to think about antioxidants. One of the ways to do that is to blanch your food. So you take all of these things that you just harvested and you put them into a pot of boiling water for 30 seconds, 45 seconds, maybe a minute, depends on the food. And that actually causes the enzymes to stop doing their damage, and you can preserve the color of whatever it is you're preserving. And so if you were to try to freeze many of the things that we're growing, they would change color in the freezer. But if you blanch them first, they'll hold their color and they'll hold their flavor. So that's one of those little things that you don't know about until you see it in a recipe. But that's why that the hot water actually causes the enzyme action to cease so that you can have the flavor and the color that you're looking for. So it looks like Chef Giovanni is wondering where I'm at. I'm in Colorado, in the Rocky Mountains, Colorado Springs, and I have a Zone 5B garden, as I said, at 7,500 feet. So it's a bit unique environment here. Oh, you're right. Thanks, Freddie. You're exactly right. Ascorbic acid is what I was talking about when I was talking about vitamin C and the tomatoes, and I misstated it as citric acid. You're exactly right. Citric acid is the lemon juice we were using for our pepper jellies. Ascorbic acid is what you use when you're, as an alternative for some of the fruits that you're going to be preserving. So thank you for correcting me on that. You are exactly right. Ascorbic acid. And the nice thing about ascorbic acid is that it comes as a powder. And so it is a way to stop the food from changing color. And so you'll see recipes where they say to sprinkle ascorbic acid on it, and that'll also stop some of that enzyme action as well. So thank you. I'm glad you were able to point that out before I got too much further and maybe led people in the wrong directions. So, yeah, mornings at the allotment. I think at high altitudes it can make more sense to do cold storage than to pressure can for many vegetables. And it does. It just makes more, it makes more sense. It's one of those kind of things that if you're going to preserve your harvest, do it in an easy way. Do it so that it's something you want to do again. You freeze food all the time. You buy meat at the market and you cut it into smaller pieces and you freeze it. There's a lot of things you freeze without even thinking about it. As far as the produce is concerned, when we think about our garden, we do need to think about how we're going to preserve it. But don't think too hard. Think about what you're already doing on your daily chores, your daily activities in the kitchen, and just think about how you can extend that a little bit into your garden. And the freezing is absolutely an easy way to accomplish that. And that's one reason. So, and it's all relative. I've made so many jams and jellies that for me, jams and jellies are easy. I actually think in many respects they're easier than making pickles. Yeah, but I've made so many pickles, I also think pickling is pretty easy. So in the beginning, it's going to be challenging. It's going to be one of those things that maybe you haven't done before. It's new. You have to take a class. You have to buy a book. You have to watch a video. You have to read a fact sheet. But once you've done it a few times, you'll realize that it really is easy. And like gardening is hard, but there are aspects about gardening that are easy. And it's the same with fermentation. It's just a whole other arena, and it's a way that you can use what you have and, more importantly, have it to use again months and months later. Especially now, so many people are increasing and expanding their gardens to grow more food for themselves, for their family. And if you don't have a method of preserving it, then you're really only doing it for as long as your garden season is. I've got a short garden season. You might have a season that's 200 days long. If you only eat fresh produce, then you can only enjoy your garden's produce for 200 days. Or actually less, because in the beginning things are starting to grow. But if you can preserve it, like we've already talked about, a year's worth of enjoyment for what you're growing in your garden today. So that's why I wanted to talk about this today. Carter Bell, thank you to you. Welcome to the channel membership. Nice to see you here. And let's see if I can get caught up for some of this stuff. Danger Lawn is saying, for young tomato plants, a few weeks until transplant. Should I? So if you're asking, should you transplant tomato plants early? I would say no. Definitely wait until after your last frost date. Get out there with a thermometer of some type, a meat thermometer, test the soil temperature, and go ahead and ideally wait until it's above 70 degrees Fahrenheit, about 21 Celsius, to have the best results. So it's better to wait a little bit longer to get your tomato plants in the ground when the conditions are right than to put them in too early. And Rick is saying, I blanched carrots. You must cool them down in cold water after blanching, then a Ziploc bag, then froze them. Yeah, and that's usually part of the blanching process, is you have your pot of boiling water, you have your bowl of ice water, and you blanch it from the boiling liquid into the ice water, then let them dry, and then freeze them. And carrots, great example of something that most of us grow, and most of us just put in the refrigerator, and most of us have those carrots that we've grown so many of them in the refrigerator that they ended up getting a little wilty and soft in the refrigerator, and then they end up at the compost pile. I'm sure I'm not the only one that's ever had that happen. But you can blanch them and chill them and dry them and put them in the freezer and have them for weeks and months to follow. So Marlene, thank you as well. Welcome to the channel. Look forward to seeing all of you on Facebook so we can share a lot of our ideas. Freddie's saying the USDA canning book goes up to 8,000 feet or above for pressure canning and has a time for above 6,000. Yeah. So that's a whole nother arena. And so when you get your canning book, this one or whatever other one you might be interested in, there will be corrections for altitude in it. So for instance, jams and jellies will have a recipe that says to water bath can, put them in the boiling water for 15 minutes. But when you do an altitude correction, it may actually end up being 20 minutes for you at your altitude. And so that's certainly true for me. Everything I can, I have to make an altitude correction for. And as Freddie points out, there will be guidelines in the canning manuals to tell you what that correction happens to be. And so you're exactly right as far as pressure canning above 6,000 feet up to 8,000 feet, but the equipment might not actually be calibrated to work above that. And that's actually the issue I've had, because I have a pressure canner that my daughter bought me, but in the fine print, it specifically says that, or I forget the exact wording, but it basically does not advise canning above 6,000 feet. And it's probably going to be okay, but it's like the when in doubt, throw it out idea. If I'm not sure that my pressure canning is going to work with the equipment I have, then it's best just not to pressure can at all. Tamara's saying for lemons, I juice and froze the juice in ice cube trays and then put the cubes in a bag for easy serving. Excellent idea. You can do that as well with a lot of the herbs. I really like drying my herbs, but you can freeze a lot of herbs too. And one of the methods is to freeze them in water in an ice cube tray, or in oil in an ice cube tray, or juice up what you're doing. I do this, so like when I'm making my rhubarb jelly, if I'm juicing, I have a steam juicer, which is very effective at juicing. If I'm juicing, I'll juice everything in one day. I've already got it out. I'll just clean it between juicings. And that's what I'll do. I'll actually juice my rhubarb and then put that juice into pint-sized freezer containers and put it in the freezer, because I want that I want that juice to stay as fresh as possible, but I might not be making rhubarb jelly for weeks to come. And so juicing and freezing is a marvelous way to preserve some of the things that you're growing and some of the things that you're using. So good suggestion for that. Okay, 99.0. If I planted tomatoes in an upside down pot, then grew beans or peas on top of the same pot, would the tomatoes benefit from nitrogen nodes those plants have in their root systems? So good question. And so there are a couple issues at play here. One being, I've grown tomatoes upside down before, and the bags for most of the upside down growing systems just aren't big enough to support an ample amount of roots. So every time I've grown tomatoes in an upside down bag, the plants themselves were smaller than the same plants that I would be growing out in the garden. So first step, the tomato plant is going to be smaller, and the roots are going to try to fill that space as much as possible. So if you plant anything else in that pot or in that bag, then they're going to be competing with the tomato root growth. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend in an upside down bag that you grow multiple plants, just because the tomatoes are already going to be stressed without enough space to begin with. And then if you grew beans or peas on top of it, you might add some additional stress. As to the second part of it, does it add nitrogen to it? Well, first off, you need the very specific bacteria that works with the nodules on the beans and the peas, those legumes, to take the nitrogen from the air and affix it to the roots of those peas and beans. So getting an inoculant might be a good place to start, because your potting soil probably doesn't have that, which means there probably wouldn't be much nitrogen created by those plants. But more importantly, the nitrogen that's being created by those legumes are going to be used by those plants first. So if you're growing the peas and the beans for the purpose of harvesting peas and beans, by the time you harvest those pods, those plants have used the nitrogen, and there isn't going to be residual nitrogen available to help out the tomatoes. If you want to give nitrogen to the tomatoes, then you actually need to pluck off the flowers and not collect any peas or beans, so that those nitrogen nodules can now dissipate into the soil to benefit the tomatoes. But now there's a third issue, which is tomatoes really don't need a nitrogen fertilizer. If you give extra nitrogen to a tomato plant, you're going to grow a nice green tomato plant that may not have the flowers and the fruit that you're looking for. So high nitrogen is typically not what we want to do to our tomato plants in the first place. And so I don't think this would really be an effective way. First off, you don't need to be giving the tomatoes the nitrogen. Secondly, they're going to be competing with each other, all these different plants. And then third, there really isn't going to be that much extra nitrogen to give, because the peas and beans are going to be using most of it. Walking on Sunshine has always lived over a mile high. Canning is not unrealistic. Done it many times at 7,500 foot Colorado. There you go. And so not unrealistic at all. It's great. Definitely one of those kind of things that we can all do it. It's just a question of how you need to modify your method so that you do it in the most effective and safe way, so that you can then eat the food months later without having any issues about it. Danger Lawn saying, I meant to ask if I should prune suckers and flowers off young tomato plants that I intend to plant in a few weeks. Okay, yes. So if you still have young tomato plants in a pot that hasn't gone outside yet, and it's starting to flower and fruit, go ahead and pinch off the flowers and the fruit. When a plant is stressed, when it's young, it gets into survival mode and it starts sending out flowers and fruit. And so often when we have these tomato plants that are in a small pot, they're stressed. They want to be outside. They want to start growing. They're not in an environment that can provide that growth. So they start setting flowers and then fruiting because they're in survival mode. Then when you put them into your garden, the plant has already been triggered into producing flowers and fruit. And now you're not going to get the root development. You're not going to get the branches and the growth of the plant that is really what you're after. So pinch them off now. And then when you put them in the garden, the plant will do one of those double takes, like, oh, wow, I love this new environment. Forget the flowers and the fruit. Let's put on new roots. Let's put up new branches. Let's grow taller. Let's put up leaves. Then when the plant gets strong enough that it can adequately support the fruit, it'll put on the flowers at a normal time, and then you'll have a much better harvest. So I know it's really hard sometimes, especially if you're new to gardening. You see that little tomato and you want to save it and baby it, but you're doing it at the detriment of the whole plant and potential harvest in the future. So it's tough, but go ahead and pinch off the flowers of those young plants before you put them outside. Coastal Gardens takes suckers as cuttings. I've actually already programmed this video into my list, so probably sometime in August I'll be making this video once I have tomatoes that are actively growing. Great idea. You can take a sucker off of a tomato plant. You could put it in water to see the roots, put it in a pot of potting mix, stick it into the ground next to your tomato plant, and it'll grow into a completely new, same clone of the tomato plant that you took the sucker off of. So I'll actually be showing that. Thanks for suggesting that. But it's one of those things I think a lot of gardeners just don't realize, which is why I want to make a video about it, that you can take those suckers and grow the exact same plant. It actually can happen pretty quickly if you do it early in the season. So great suggestion. So Riverdale Gardens, nice to see you here on a Monday. Grew okra for the first time last year for fun. Have any experience with pickling okra? I'd like to try it. So yes, actually, I'm not a big okra fan. Never really was a big okra fan. But years ago, I started growing okra specifically to pickle the okra because my wife loved pickled okra in addition to my pickled green beans. So yeah, I have had some experience with that. I haven't fermented okra, so I've only done the pickling using the vinegar and just used I think one of the Ball Blue Book okra pickle recipe, which was probably just a pickling spice, nothing fancy with the flavor. Very easy to do, very easy to do. And if you're one of those that's not a big fan of okra, you might like pickled okra. It's one of those things that can actually do pretty well. SC is cold composting in a huge grow bag. Is this a good idea and will I succeed? Oh, sure. Yeah, I've got a video. I call it lazy composting. And most of my composting, this pile back here is primarily a cold composting method. And it takes longer. You have to be careful because it can become anaerobic. Most of the composting we do is aerobic, where you have the bacteria that need oxygen to survive. And in a bag, especially in a cold composting where you're not turning it and you're kind of ignoring it, you can get anaerobic conditions set up pretty quickly. And so that adds to smell. And so don't be surprised that your cold composting bag can begin smelling over time. You might get in there and turn it occasionally, try to get some more oxygen in there. But yeah, you should succeed. Just realize that it can take a long time, a year or more, using a cold composting method. And beyond that, it's usable and good for the garden. Christine ran into an issue where grass clippings in a container turned into a fly and maggot nightmare. Any ideas or help on how to avoid? Same basic idea. If you are turning your grass pile, if you're adding oxygen to it, if you're trying to keep it drier, then you're not going to have it smell, become anaerobic, or in this case, same thing, flies and maggots come in. So they're drawn to that wet, smelly environment. That's what's drawing flies in. The flies lay their eggs and then the maggots emerge. So if you can avoid that anaerobic, smelly mess to start with, then you shouldn't have the issue with the flies or the maggots. And it might be just, I get piles and bags of grass clippings, and I'll just fluff it up just to introduce oxygen occasionally, and that helps cut down on some of those issues. So let's see what else we have. So Masabi Gal is asking, have you ever used salting methods for preservation? So I sort of. So I haven't done just salt. I haven't tried to preserve fish or meat in just a salt preservation. But I do make jerkies. I've made turkey jerky, beef jerky, fish jerky using salt and dehydration as a primary method for dehydrating and preserving those types of meats. And a salt preservation essentially does that. It draws the water out. It also creates that salty environment that also hinders the bacteria growth as well. But other than making jerky, which I love, another one of my favorite ways to preserve meats, I have not done it as a primary preservation method. Yeah, definitely something you could experiment with. I mean, there are many cultures in the world that salted meat is or salted fish is a primary part of their diet. I just haven't grown up with that, so it's one of those things I actually don't think about. And so Jen's asking if I have a jerky recipe, and so I use an approved recipe, and it's been modified over the years. So I'll just use a typical jerky recipe that you'll see on a extension home preserver fact sheet or USDA web page, and then I like to use garlic and red pepper on my jerky, a slightly spicier jerky. But the basic method of dehydrating the meat is exactly the same that you'll see on a number of different places. Just look for a jerky recipe, and Ball has some. I know, I'm pretty sure this book has a number of different jerky recipes in it. I know the USDA has got some stuff on their website. I know in Colorado on the food preserver, there's a food preserver website, there's a fact sheet on how to make jerkies. And then it's just a matter of how you choose to season that jerky after you make it. So, this is one of those things, like I said, we can modify the recipe once you learn how to do it. Every batch of jerky I make is a little bit different. Sometimes it's nothing but black pepper. Sometimes it's garlic and red pepper. Sometimes I've experimented with using thyme and oregano. I use all kinds of different spices, but I tend to just do a basic salt and pepper and a little bit of garlic powder when I make my jerky. Love it. And I'll even munch on it in the garden when I'm doing stuff like that. So, Wasabi Gal, time for a Gardner Scott Preserving Cookbook. Thanks for the idea. I make the videos. I've got quite a few videos on preserving. And for me, that's my cookbook because I actually show how to do it. I got pesto, for instance, garlic scape pesto. I know you haven't seen that video because very few people have. But that's one of those things. I grow the garlic. Hard neck garlic will send up the scapes, and most often, people will cut those scapes and then use them in cooking. Well, you can take those scapes and make into a pesto. And I made a video on how to make garlic scape pesto. So check out some of my videos. I actually got some diverse. I've got a video on kale chips. I like growing kale. I like putting fresh kale in a salad, but I really like the crunch and the taste of a kale chip that has been dehydrated. I got a video on that. So I haven't made a preservation video in a while, but I'll be doing more this year, especially now that you all are thinking about it. And there's just so many different ways you can do it. And rather than me making a cookbook, I'll just make more videos, and then you can see how I'm actually doing it. Hi, Yankee Sister. Nice to see you here as always. Always learning on the lives and videos, and you're very welcome for that. And everybody is amazing, absolutely. So appreciate that contribution. Always nice to see you here on our Monday get-togethers. It's absolutely a lot of fun. And Bohemian Herbology Natural Solutions. Check out the garlic scapes pesto video. Good. Yeah, it's I think it's about a 4-year-old video, so it's back in my library a little bit. You might have to search for a little bit. So whenever I mention that I've got a video, I will put the buzzwords in the description, or when I upload the video, I'll put the keywords that in the keyword section that YouTube has. And so you should be able to go to YouTube and just write in the search term at the top of the page and put Gardner Scott pesto, and that video should come up. So any of these videos we talk about, Gardner Scott fermented beets, that video will come up. So you don't need to spend a lot of time searching for this stuff through my library. Start with just a simple YouTube search, and most likely it's going to pop up right away. There aren't a lot of Gardner Scotts out there other than me, and I always put the main subject matter in the keyword to make it easier if you happen to do a search on it. So that's always a good way to start. Oh, there you go. Jay's on top of it as always. There's how to make garlic escape pesto. A nice link to that. Appreciate it. And yeah, that was a fun one to make. And I did it last year. So I made the video like 4 years ago. And last year I made my garlic escape pesto and used it on pasta. And it's really good. I love pesto. I actually just discovered yesterday that I still have a container of my basil pesto that I made last year. And so basil is really difficult to preserve. You can try freezing it, and I've had limited success with that. Freezing it in oil is really the preferred method. But what I did is made pesto with the olive oil and the nuts and the basil, and then put it into a container and then freeze the container. It will continue to, or can oxidize, so change color when you take it out of the freezer. And so to avoid the color change and potential flavor change in the freezer, just put a light layer of olive oil on top of it. So you put your pesto in a container, put a little bit of olive oil on top of it, and then over the course of months, and I thought I had used it all, but I discovered I still had some, I just will spoon out some of this frozen pesto to mix in with a pasta dish. So a really quick, easy lunch to just make up a quick batch of pasta, scoop out some of the pesto and mix it into the hot pasta, and you have a quick lunch with the fresh basil pesto or garlic escape pesto that you made months beforehand. So that's where all of these preservation ideas don't necessarily need to be for long-term food storage to feed your family. It could be as simple as just new ways to use your herbs in your cooking, or new ways to use some of the harvest that you hadn't ever really thought much about. Tamara's saying with the kale chips, crush the kale with hand, olive oil, and lemon juice, then add sea salt, paprika, cayenne, chili powder, garlic powder, coconut sugar. That's interesting. I haven't thought about doing coconut sugar and having a sweet kale chip. So nice idea. But yeah, the basic sea salt on a kale chip I absolutely love. And I have done the garlic and have done the cayenne as well. But that's actually an interesting idea to do coconut sugar. So I think I'm going to try that as well. See, you can always experiment with new ideas, and you can learn from the other people that are doing it. You know, if you really get into it, there are groups and organizations and clubs. And so if you have a county fair that you like to go to, or a state fair, there's usually one building or one room that's set aside for all of the jars that people have canned, all of the jams and jellies, all of the pickles, and they're judged and they present ribbons. And so in my experience, at least here in Colorado, it's always the same people that win the ribbons every year. And I actually knew a lot of those people because they were in the program with me, and they lived for that. They lived for not only preserving their food, but taking it to the fair to be judged to win a ribbon. And because it always tends to be the same people, you can actually break into that world pretty easily by just striking up a conversation, finding out if there's a club or an organization. They might even mentor you, and now you can become a ribbon-winning food preserver by just making a jar of pickles and taking it to the county fair. Surprisingly easy how you can be competitive in this world of preservation. So I bet you hadn't even thought about that as an option. We think about doing this for eating it and feeding our family, but you can also do it on a competition level as well, which is actually kind of fun. I actually like going to the fair and seeing what people have done. And so, yeah, Stephanie loves to go to the state fairs as well. It's one of those things you can see what other people are doing and find out that really it's not that hard and you can do it all yourself. So Matt again, love the channel. I'm glad you do. Thanks so much. I just bought my first house in southern New Mexico desert. Congratulations. And channel has helped me with my first raised bed garden. Good for you. Well, congratulations on the house. Congratulations on the first garden. And glad I can help, and everyone else that's here today, because there's a lot of good information to share. And hello to you, Tron, back again from Vietnam. So nice to see you back again this week. Lars says, someone stole my recipe and won the Minnesota State Fair Award for dill pickles. Wow. So I wasn't suggesting when you go to the state fair that you steal other people's recipes, just learn from them instead. I'm sorry to hear that they stole your recipe and won, but it goes to show that you had a good recipe. So that's fantastic. I say go head to head with them and win back the trophy, show them who's the boss. So that's funny. Okay, let's see. Prepper Chris is asking, can Brussels sprouts regrow after seeding? So if you're talking about if the Brussels sprouts were actually, or the plant was seeding, or had gone to seed, flower, and then seeded, will it regrow? So yes, the plant will continue growing over time, but this holds true for brassicas and most of the plants that we're growing in our garden. Once they've gone into seed mode, flower and seed mode in particular, then the plants have shifted to stay in seed mode. And so most brassicas are biennials, where in the first year is typically when we're harvesting from them. In the second season is when they'll go to seed, and then they'll die after that. So yes, technically the Brussels sprouts will continue to grow, but don't expect that they're going to put any more sprouts on. In fact, expect that after they've seeded, the plant will die, within a few months, most likely, and you'll need to clean it out of your garden. It's one of those things that that's just the life cycle of most of those plants. But you can still harvest if anything is still on the plant. So, okay. Colorado Bird Nerd, nice to see you here on a Monday as well, as always. Thank you for that contribution. Another wonderful Monday morning of gardening talk. Learned so much again today. Good. That's why I do this, of course, and try to get you all thinking about some things that you might not normally think about in the gardening world. And preservation is just so easy to do. Once you do it, you just have to start doing it. And then you need to learn more about it. And then before you know it, and I've said this before, I think I might have said it last week or the week before, there is so much I grow for the purpose of preserving that it's just part of my normal gardening now. I just don't even really think about it. I just know that I'm going to be growing those plants with the intent of preserving them. I'll use some of it fresh, but the quantities I grow are because of preservation. And that's a whole nother factor. It ties in with some of what we were talking about last week, which is planning for the harvest. And that's planning for how you're going to use the crop. And using the crop should have a preservation component to it. And then you'll be good to go after that point. And thanks, Jay. I did want to mention that today. So this is my garden today, taken this morning. And I'd like to start now, get back into the trend of featuring your gardens. Again, as we move into spring, there'll be more green for us to show off. And so I'd love you to have your garden as my backdrop. And Jay has sent the reminder, gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com is the place to send it. Landscape, a large file, and permission for me to use it. And then I'll add it to the queue. And I haven't checked this week, but I'd run out of photos. And so I know some of you had sent me photos, but if it wasn't in a landscape format, or if the file wasn't large enough, or I didn't have your specific permission to use it as a background image, than I didn't. So I've actually had some wonderful photos that some of you have sent, but if it was lacking one of those things, then I didn't show it as a background. You may have assumed I was going to put it up, and if you haven't seen it yet, then that's probably been one of the issues why I haven't shown it. But I'm ready to show more, so send me your pictures, gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com, and we'll start showcasing some of the other gardeners or other gardens we have. And so one of the reasons I wanted to show this picture today was to not only have you take a look at it. Here's a brand new fruit tree that I just put in. That's one of the ones that I showed in the video. And there's another one that I just put in. I've got fencing around it to help keep the deer and mala away from my trees. But it looks like it's a nice sunny spring day in my garden. And it is a nice sunny spring day in my garden. But when I took this picture, after the sun came up, it was 26 degrees Fahrenheit in my garden, which is about -3.5 Celsius. So you can't always look out and expect that everything is going to be suitable for your plants to start growing. There was a wonderful video. So you know that the Kitchen Garden with Eli and Kate is one of my favorite gardening channels. They've just changed the name to In the Garden with Eli and Kate. And the video that they just came out with is about keeping a garden journal. And you've heard me talk before about keeping a garden journal and why it's so important in your individual gardens. It's because of days like today. It looks sunny. It looks like it's time to get out. It's warming up today. It's already above freezing by now, I'm sure. And so I would be tempted to go out and start putting some plants in the ground. I was at one of the home centers this weekend, and they're selling their tomatoes and their peppers and their basil and a lot of other plants, and people are buying them to put into their garden because it's nice and sunny and bright, and the store's selling it, so it must be good to plant, right? No. This is where a garden journal, this is where experience comes into your gardening. Because today I am still 3 weeks, actually 3.5 weeks away from my last frost date. I am 5 weeks away from when I'm going to be putting my tomatoes in the ground. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the soil temperature is important. The air temperature at night is important to put tomatoes in your garden. And even though they're being sold at the garden center, it's 5 weeks before anyone in my area should be thinking about putting tomatoes into the garden. Be careful. This is that time of year so many new gardeners fall into this trap. You don't have that experience. You don't know yet the importance of nighttime temperatures and soil temperatures, and you see things being sold and you succumb because it's sunny and warm out and you want to put the plants in the ground. Last week we had record-setting temperatures. We had one day that got up to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 27 Celsius, unheard of in my region in the middle of April. But it hit, and people were at the stores buying plants because it was hot out and it felt like spring. Looking at the weather forecast at the middle of last week when we were having those high temperatures, we were supposed to get cool last night. The forecast called for the temperature to drop down to freezing and then warm back up again this next week. And so this next week it's supposed to be warm. But as we got closer to the weekend, the forecast changed. And so what was supposed to be a 32 degree Fahrenheit night last night, 0 degrees Celsius, instead it was much colder than that. I'm not sure exactly how cold it got, but after sunrise, it warmed up to 26 degrees. And this is where the garden journal comes into play. You can make note of these kind of things. Yep, once again, the forecast was wrong. Once again, on April 25th, it was below freezing at night. And you start tracking some of these things in your journal over time, and you don't fall into that trap of buying a plant that isn't going to survive in your garden. Keep track of what's happening in your garden, and don't let others, there are so many videos out there that say, this is what you should plant in March, or this is what you should plant in April, or this is what you should plant in May. And if you go through my library, you'll see I don't have those kind of videos, because what is appropriate for me to plant in April is probably not appropriate for you. And what's appropriate for me to plant in May, you probably planted it in March, because we're all different. We all have the different climates, but we all need to track our own garden so that we're making the best decisions for us. At the garden club meeting I had last week, there were a number of us talking to some of the new gardeners who had shown up to our garden club meeting for the first time. And we were talking about the weather and how it was tempting to put plants out at this time of year. And each of us told the story of about 15 years ago where we had to plant our gardens 3 times. And it was the same year. We all live in the same area. And that year in particular, we had severe weather that hit unexpectedly and killed the entire garden. And all of us replanted, and then it happened again, and then all of us replanted. Those are the kind of things, obviously, we remember them to be able to talk about it in conversation. But those are the kind of things that it's time to start documenting, for you to document. So you can start keeping track of what happened and what the results were, and hopefully learn from it so that next year, when you see a weather pattern like we have in Colorado, always warms up in April, then it cools down the beginning of May, then it warms back up again the middle of May, and then we can plant the beginning of June. That's the way my garden works. Figure out what works for your garden so that you don't waste your money at the big box store buying something that's just not going to survive. And I was so tempted with this one couple. They were a couple people ahead of me in line, and they were buying tomatoes, and a young couple. And I thought, should I go up to them and tell them that they shouldn't plant their tomatoes? They need to wait. Or let them learn for themselves and make the mistake. And then I thought, if you were standing in line in a store and some old guy came up to you and said, oh, you shouldn't plant those tomatoes, it's too early, you'd nod and you'd be polite and you'd still buy the tomatoes and you'd still go home and you'd still plant them. Now you learn from your own experience. And so that's what this young couple is going to do, is they're going to learn from their own experience. I'm trying to save you some of that hardship, being the old guy saying, don't plant those tomatoes too early. It's because you've got to figure out when the right time is for your garden, your climate, what weather patterns you have, and hopefully make the best decisions for you. So, yeah, Tamara says, I could tell him I'm the famous gardener, Scott. A few people know that, but most people don't, but thanks for that. So just wanted to share that with you today, just because it happens every year that I can't imagine the thousands of dollars worth of plants that are being sold and end up dying just because the gardener doesn't know enough yet to have some patience and to wait and maybe learn from someone a little more experienced. Sometimes the best teacher is that failure, is trying it and figuring out what went wrong. And that's why I say, do the garden check Eli suggested in their last video and learn from it so that you don't repeat the same mistakes. I hope that helps. And I hope you have a great gardening week. I'm going out to do more in my garden here. And I heard Mala barking a little bit, so I'm sure she's anxious for me to get out there. And I'll be back next week, Monday, of course, same time, same channel, to share all the great information with you. And I hope you start thinking about preserving your harvests. And we'll talk more about that in the future. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.